She hadn't expected the mountain to sound different once the papers were signed, but as soon as she stepped out of the lawyer's office and into the thin, high country air, the silence felt changed, like someone had taken a thick blanket off her life and replaced it with a sharper, cleaner one. The peaks rose around town in a ring of faded blue, snow caught in their folds, and somewhere up there, above the last switchback, past the forgotten trailhead and the rusted gate, waited a cabin that now, somehow, officially belonged to her. The word, belonged, still felt foreign on her tongue. For most of her life, she'd been the one passing through other people's spaces, borrowed couches, trailers that smelled of someone else's cooking, rentals with thin walls and thinner patience. The cabin was different. Or it had the potential to be, if she could make herself believe she deserved something that stayed. "It's a lot of upkeep," the lawyer had warned, fingers fussing with the knot of his tie, as if the inheritance personally offended him. "Your grandfather didn't modernize. You can sell if it's too much." She'd looked past him to the framed photo of the mountain on his wall and thought, not for the first time, that he had no idea what too much meant. "I'll see it first," she'd said, "then decide." Now, hours later, the truck bumped along the narrowing dirt road, climbing in slow, determined coils. The forest thickened on either side, pine and fir packed tight, their branches knitting overhead in places like fingers laced to keep secrets in. Beside her, Coda sprawled across the passenger seat, chin on the window edge, nose leaving damp half-moons on the glass. The dog's coat was a rough patchwork of gray and black, his eyes a warm amber that softened the hard edges of his wolfish profile. She'd found him 3 winters back, ribs showing, paw shredded by a trap someone had set and forgotten. Or maybe hadn't forgotten at all. She'd carried him to the vet alone, paid the bill in installments, and somewhere between the stitches and the long, quiet drives, they'd become a kind of two-being pack. When the road finally kinked into the last narrow curve and the trees parted, the cabin came into view like it had been holding its breath behind the ridge and now exhaled at the sight of her. It sat in a small clearing, snow retreating from its stone foundation in thin, frosted patches, the steep roof slouching under years of weather. Smoke hadn't risen from its chimney in a long time. The front porch sagged slightly at the middle, boards silvered by sun and rain. It should have felt eerie, she thought, this place that had waited through wars and weddings and funerals without anyone opening its door. Instead, it looked tired, like an old man left sitting in a chair too long, stiff but still there, still willing to try if someone helped him up. "Well," she murmured, cutting the engine. "We're home. Or close. Enough." Coda hopped out first, landing in the gravel with a soft grunt, stretching until his spine popped. He sniffed the air, tail sweeping low, not wagging exactly, but moving with a kind of cautious curiosity. Mountain air carried different scents than the valley. Sap and damp earth, and the faint metallic sweetness of snowmelt somewhere just out of sight. She stood for a moment and simply listened. The thin whistle of wind in the treetops, the distant gossip of a creek, the occasional snowmelt drip from the eaves. No cars, no neighbor's television bleeding through drywall. Just space. She hadn't realized how starved she was for it until that moment. The front door resisted at first, swollen in its frame, but a firm shoulder and a muttered curse convinced it to give. Inside, dust rose in a faint pale cloud, catching in the shaft of light from the porch like 1,000 tiny, startled birds. The air smelled of old wood and cold iron, with an undertone of something herbal, dried sage maybe, or the ghost of it. Her grandfather had died the kind of quiet death mountain people preferred. In his sleep, alone, with more unsent letters than friends. She'd only met him twice as a child, both times in town, never up here. He'd sent her exactly one thing in her life, a pocket knife with a carved handle and no note. Her mother had rolled her eyes when the package came, muttered something about stubborn men and stubborn mountains, but she'd never thrown the knife away. It sat now in the pocket of her worn jacket, pressing a small, solid reassurance against her ribs. Coda padded ahead, nails ticking on the floorboards, nose working steadily. He moved from chair to hearth to window, mapping the space in careful arcs. "Check it out," she told him, half smiling. "You're the inspector. I just sign things." The main room was simple. A table, 4 chairs, a sagging sofa, a narrow bookshelf with a handful of titles whose spines were cracked and sun-faded. The kitchen nook held an old enamel sink, cabinets with doors slightly ajar, a wood stove squatting under a stained metal hood. Everything was functional, nothing was pretty. That suited her. She'd had enough of pretty lies. What the cabin needed was work. Real, splinter in your fingers, ache in your shoulders work. And for the first time in a long time, the idea didn't exhaust her. It steadied her. She spent the first day opening windows, airing out rooms, hauling in wood from the small lean-to out back. By evening, a hesitant warmth had crept into the walls, chasing off the sharpest teeth of the cold. She unrolled her mattress in the loft, set a bowl and blanket for Coda at the foot of the ladder, and lay awake listening to the new old sounds. The crack of settling beams, the hiss of wind at the eaves, Coda's slow, even breathing. The next morning, she found the first problem. "Water line's shot," she muttered, crouching beside the crawlspace hatch and shining a flashlight into the gloom. The pipes that should have delivered meltwater from the uphill spring lay in a tangle of rust and mineral-streaked joints, one length split clean open. Not surprising, really. The cabin hadn't been plumbed since before her parents were born. She could patch, improvise, build new runs. She'd learned enough over the years fixing other people's rentals to make do with less. Still, staring at the mess, she felt that familiar wave of being alone rise and test her balance. There would be no landlord this time. No one to blame if something failed. Only her. Only the dog. Only the mountain. "Guess we start with what we can see," she said, straightening. Renovation, she decided on the drive up, would be her way of making peace with this inheritance. Every board she sanded, every nail she set, would be a small argument with the idea that she didn't deserve anything solid. She started with the interior walls. The main room was divided by one that felt unnecessary now. A thin partition of tongue and groove planks that separated the front sitting area from a small, cramped alcove where a narrow cot still crouched under a dusty blanket. Maybe, once, someone else had lived here, or maybe her grandfather had simply liked having a space to retreat into, a second layer of solitude inside the first. She didn't want that. She wanted light, air, a sight line from the front door to the back windows that would let her feel like nothing was sneaking up from either direction. Coda seemed to agree. He sniffed along the base of the wall, sneezed, then retreated to a sun patch as if washing his paws of the decision. She fetched the crowbar from the truck, ran her hand once along the old wood, and set the metal teeth into the gap between boards. The first plank came away with a protest of nails, but no real fight. like it had been waiting years for someone to relieve it of duty. Dust billowed. She coughed, eyes watering. Coda trotted over, then wisely backed off, choosing a vantage point near the door where he could watch without inhaling a century. Board by board, she peeled the wall open. Behind it, the alcove looked even smaller, less like a room and more like a box someone had built around themselves. She tore that wall down too, watching the space widen with each swing of her arm. Light flowed differently now, the afternoon sun slanting through the west window and stretching farther across the floor. Her shoulders burned. Sweat trickled down her back despite the cold. It felt good. Honest. On the third day of tearing and prying and hauling, the hammer slipped. She cursed under her breath, shook out her stinging fingers, and stepped back for perspective. Only one narrow section of the old interior wall remained, a vertical strip about 3 feet wide that ran from floor to ceiling, backed by planks darker than the surrounding wood. She frowned. "Why would you leave this here, Elias?" she murmured, not sure whether she was asking the dead man or herself. It made no structural sense. The beams above were supported elsewhere. This was just a sliver of something left behind. Coda padded over, tail low but not tucked, and pressed his nose to the dark wood. He inhaled once, twice, and then let out a noise she hadn't heard from him in a long time. A low, uncertain whine, the kind that used to come from him in his sleep when old nightmares chased his paws. The sound prickled her skin. "It's just wood," she said quietly, though her voice betrayed the doubt she suddenly felt. She tapped the hammer lightly against the planks. The sound wasn't hollow, not exactly. It was muted, thick, like hitting something that had another layer behind it. Something that didn't want to ring. "One more, then we're done," she told Coda, more to steady herself than to inform him. She wedged the crowbar into the seam and leaned her weight into it. For a second, nothing happened. Then the board split with a crack like a snapped bone, the top half swinging inward while the bottom tore free. Behind it, instead of the dusty vertical studs she expected, was metal. Dark, dull, rough with age. She froze, breath catching. The dog backed up a step, ears flattened, then slowly crept forward again, drawn by the new scent. The exposed surface was larger than a simple plate or bracket. It filled the space from floor to ceiling, the edges pressed tight against the surrounding studs. An old iron panel, she thought at first, maybe some kind of reinforcement. But as she brushed away the splinters and dust, a shape began to emerge. A rectangle defined by a narrow frame, its corners rounded by time, its center broken by a seam so fine she'd almost missed it. Set into that seam, at chest height, was a handle, or what had once been one, a thick iron bar, curved slightly outward, orange with rust, but still solid. Not reinforcement. A door. An iron door. Her stomach dropped in a way that was both fear and a strange, unwelcome thrill. "You've got to be kidding me," she whispered. The cabin had been built in the late 1920s, according to the township records the lawyer had shown her, a time when people in these mountains worried more about weather than intruders. Hidden iron doors were not part of the usual floor plan. Coda pressed his nose close to the seam and inhaled. His body went still. She watched the fur lift slowly along his spine, from shoulders to tail, as if some old instinct was rising through him like static. He didn't growl. If anything, the silence from him was worse. "What do you smell?" she asked. He looked back at her, and for a heartbeat she had the ridiculous thought that if he could speak, he'd tell her to leave it alone. But he couldn't speak, and she couldn't pretend she hadn't seen this. A door built of iron, hidden behind a wall in a cabin sealed since before her mother was born. Someone had gone to a great deal of trouble to make sure no one knew it was here. A person like her, someone who had spent years believing the universe mostly forgot about her, didn't just stumble onto something like this and walk away. She drew in a deep breath, tasted dust and metal, and the faintest hint of something else on the back of her tongue. Old oil, maybe, or the ghost of it. She set her palm against the iron. The chill bit through her glove almost instantly, crawling into her skin. Beneath the rust and roughness, she felt grooves, lines carved in a pattern her fingers traced before her mind could catch up. Circles, angles, a shape that might have once been a symbol but had softened with time. An old industrial-style padlock hung uselessly from a staple near the handle, its shackle cut clean through sometime in the distant past. Whoever had sealed the cabin from the outside had not locked this door from the inside. They'd hidden it, disguised it. But at some point, someone here had gone through it. She swallowed, throat suddenly dry. Okay, she said quietly to herself, to Coda, to the silent weight of iron. So the old man was keeping secrets. The hammer in her hand felt inadequate now, like a toy. The door was thick enough that even if it had been locked, she wouldn't have had much hope of forcing it. But the cut padlock suggested it might still move, if the hinges hadn't frozen into statues. She wrapped her fingers around the handle. The metal was rough but solid. Coda took another step back, giving the door more space, as if he expected something to come out rather than go in. "Last chance to vote no," she murmured. He said nothing. She pulled. At first, the door didn't budge. The muscles in her arm strung tight. Rust grated beneath her grip. For a heartbeat, she felt relief. Maybe it was just decorative, some abandoned project, a false front. Then, with a sound like the mountain clearing its throat, the lower hinge gave a fraction, a deep, grinding groan rolling through the wall and into her bones. The seam widened by the width of a fingernail. Cold, stale air squeezed out, carrying with it a smell that made her instincts recoil. Not rot, not mold, but the sterile metallic tang of old machines and something chemical and bitter, faint but unmistakable. Coda snarled under his breath, a low, warning sound. Her heart thudded in answer. She could stop now. Nail the boards back. Pretend she'd never found it. Call the lawyer. Say the cabin was too much. Let him sell it to someone with more curiosity and less sense. But the truth hit her with the same clarity that had brought her up the mountain in the first place. Running had never actually saved her from anything. It had only delayed the moments when she had to face herself. This door wasn't just a piece of metal. It was a line, and she was so tired of backing away from lines. She set her feet more firmly, gripped the handle with both hands, and pulled again, harder. The iron shrieked against its hinges, a long, protesting wail that set her teeth on edge and sent a flock of birds exploding out of the trees outside. Dust rained from the ceiling. The seam widened another inch, then 2, revealing a slice of darkness so pure it seemed to drink the light around it. Air spilled out, colder than the cabin, licking at her face with the faint, sour scent of things kept too long in the dark. Coda's growl deepened, but he didn't run. He stayed at her side, shoulder brushing her leg, his body rigid and ready. "All right, Elias," she whispered, heart pounding, adrenaline whispering old, unwelcome memories of different doors and different unknowns. "What the hell were you hiding back here? With one final grinding heave, the door lurched open far enough for a person to slip through. Beyond the threshold yawned a narrow corridor of concrete and shadow, the walls lined with pipes and cables that disappeared into the gloom like roots into soil. A single naked bulb hung from the ceiling a few feet in, its glass opaque with dust. Something in the dark ticked once, like cooling metal. Then everything went still again. She stood on the threshold, fingers still wrapped around the iron, and understood with a clarity that made her dizzy that whatever lay beyond that doorway wasn't just part of her grandfather's past. It was about to become part of hers. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, the cold breathing out of the darkness brushing her face like the exhale of something that had waited too long to be seen. Coda pressed close to her leg, not retreating, but tense in a way that told her he didn't like what he smelled. And she didn't blame him. The corridor ahead looked wrong, not dangerous in an obvious way, just wrong. Too narrow, too cold, too quiet. Still, she stepped in. The beam of her flashlight stretched down the concrete passage, catching pipes wrapped in dusty insulation and rusted brackets that hadn't felt a human hand in decades. The air tasted metallic, faintly chemical, not rot, not mold, something sharper, manufactured. At the end of the corridor was another door. Thick, steel, bolted into the mountain itself. No handle, only a circular metal plate at chest height, worn smooth by old hands. She pressed her palm against it. For the second time that day, she felt warmth where there should have been nothing but frozen metal. The door clicked, one mechanical spark, then another, and slowly, with a long, low grind, it slid sideways into the wall. A breath of warmer air spilled out, not fresh, just warmer, stale, carrying the scent of oil and long-slept machinery. Coda growled low but didn't back away. Beyond the door lay a chamber, not a room, an installation, a bunker hidden beneath a cabin that had no business being tied to machinery like this. On one wall, dusty shelves. On another, metal cabinets behind fogged glass. But at the center stood the thing that stole her breath. A massive steel cylinder bolted into the rock, cables feeding into it, gauges dead but intact, a pressure chamber built into the mountain. She approached slowly. Coda stayed right at her side. A brass plate was bolted above the machine, the letters faded but legible under her flashlight. Subsurface pressure retention chamber. Project Hollow, a controlled failure may destroy the ridge. Report damage immediately. Her mouth went dry. She looked back at the chamber and her stomach dropped. A thin line of moisture glistened along the weld at the base. Just one drop, then another. Barely visible, but enough. Something beneath the mountain was shifting. Her grandfather hadn't hidden this because he wanted privacy. He hid it because it was dangerous, and because he was trying to protect something or someone. Her first instinct was stupidly practical. Find a valve, a switch, anything she could use to stabilize the pressure. But this wasn't a leaking pipe in an old rental. This was geological engineering, a 90-year-old experiment buried under a cabin that hadn't been meant to ever reopen. She touched Coda's head, grounding herself. "We're done here," she murmured. She snapped a picture of the plate on her phone, then the moisture at the weld. She paced backward toward the corridor, flashlight sweeping across shadows that felt heavier now, as though the mountain itself was listening. They stepped into the cabin's light again like surfacing from deep water. For a moment, she just stood there, hands shaking. Then she grabbed her keys and headed for the truck. The road down the mountain felt longer, the switchbacks sharper. The whole valley suddenly seemed fragile, A thin strip of life stretched below a giant that had been held together by a rusting steel chamber and her grandfather's stubborn secrecy. At the first overlook, she finally got a shred of cell signal. The call connected on the second ring. 112, what's your emergency? Her voice wavered only once. There's an underground facility beneath my cabin, something called Project Hollow. One of the pressure chambers is leaking. It could affect the ridge. Silence, then a shift in the operator's tone, from routine to alert. Stay off the mountain. Authorities are being dispatched immediately. She drove back to town and waited by the cafe, Coda leaning against her leg as if he understood everything. Trucks rolled in with blinking lights, marked with geological and emergency symbols she didn't recognize. A woman in heavy boots and a wind-burned face stepped out, introduced herself as a field engineer, listened carefully to the details, and didn't doubt a single word. By nightfall, a team headed up the ridge. She wasn't allowed to go with them. She sat on the tailgate of her truck, Coda's head in her lap, staring at the dark silhouette of the mountain against the sky and wondering what her grandfather had carried alone all these years. It took 3 months. 3 months of trucks going up and down the road, of warning signs posted at trailheads, of engineers in heavy jackets giving updates she barely understood. They drained the pressure through controlled vents, carved deeper into stone, reinforced the old chamber with modern fill, sealed every tunnel with concrete and steel plates thicker than anything built in 1930. When they were finally done, the lead engineer met her in town. "It's stable now," the woman said, "as stable as geology allows. Whatever your grandfather prevented back then, your call prevented it again. The cabin was hers again. The mountain was safe again." That first night back, she sat on the porch with a mug of tea, Coda stretched at her feet. The forest breathed its normal sounds. A woodpecker hammered somewhere down the slope. Snow melted in thin threads off the eaves. She glanced at the rebuilt wall inside, the one that now hid a welded steel seal and layers of reinforcement behind it. The danger was gone. The secret buried again. But this time, the truth wasn't a burden carried alone. She reached down and scratched behind Coda's ears. "You did good," she whispered. "All of this started because you smelled something behind a wall." The dog thumped his tail. The mountain wind swept across the porch, cool and clean. And for the first time since she inherited the cabin, the place felt like a home that could finally, safely stay hers.